The sky tore open in a blinding flash of blue and green, rippling like water disturbed by a violent force. It wasn't a storm. It wasn't some freak natural disaster. It was the arrival of the Zalcor Dominion, an empire spanning over 1,000 worlds, known for their brutal conquest of lesser species. Their warships, sleek and cruel in design, hovered in Earth's orbit, casting long shadows over cities that had no idea what was coming. The United Nations warning sirens blared across the globe, but it was already too late. The message had come 3 hours prior. By order of the Zalcor High Council, your species is deemed unfit for sovereignty. Surrender, and you may serve. Resist, and you will be purged. Humanity was given no time to respond before the first attack commenced. Energy beams lanced down from orbit, striking military installations, communication centers, and even civilian hubs. The world's greatest cities, New York, Beijing, London, Moscow, burned in minutes. It was supposed to be over before it even started. The Zalcor had done this before. They had wiped out civilizations that had barely discovered space travel, crushed species that had warred among themselves for centuries, and enslaved entire planets before they could fight back. But they had never faced humans before. And they had no idea what they had just unleashed. The initial days were chaos. Governments scrambled to coordinate defenses. The world's militaries, divided by politics and decades of mistrust, were forced to work together against a common enemy. Underground resistance groups formed, ordinary civilians took up arms, and scientists raced to reverse engineer the fallen alien technology. And then, something terrifying happened. The Zalcor expected submission. They expected fear. Instead, they got rage. Entire cities, even those that had already been reduced to rubble, became battlegrounds of relentless insurgency. The Zalcor were used to swift victories, but on Earth, every street, every ruined building, every dark alley became a death trap. They had superior weapons, faster ships, and years of experience in galactic warfare. But humans were different. They adapted, they learned, and they did not forgive. A Zalcor warlord once remarked that humans fought like animals backed into a corner. He was wrong. Humans fought like creatures that had spent their entire history perfecting war. The real turning point came when the first Zalcor dreadnought fell. It wasn't taken down by a rival fleet. It wasn't sabotaged by another empire. No, humanity, the so-called lesser species, brought it down with nothing more than stolen alien tech, modified with terrifying efficiency. They reverse-engineered Zalcor energy weapons and strapped them onto their primitive jets. They learned how to hijack the Dominion's communications and fed false intelligence back to the invaders. The Zalcor thought they were hunting humans, but in reality, they were being hunted. For the first time in their history, the Zalcor felt fear. They had declared war on a planet of warriors, survivors, and strategists, and they had made a mistake that could not be undone. The High Council watched in horror as reports poured in, battalions lost overnight, warships hijacked, supply chains obliterated. Entire fleets, once untouchable, were vanishing in the darkness of space, hunted by human pilots who had learned to use Zalcor technology better than the Zalcor themselves. Panic spread among the Dominion's leadership. What had started as a routine conquest had turned into an unrelenting nightmare. Humanity was no longer fighting for survival. They were fighting for vengeance. And they weren't stopping until every last invader was gone. The High Council convened in secrecy, their reptilian faces twisted in expressions of disbelief. One of them, a veteran of over 100 planetary conquests, finally spoke the words they had all been dreading. "We must retreat." Silence followed. The Zalcor Dominion had never retreated in its entire history. Their empire was built on strength, on dominance. To retreat was unthinkable. But then another voice, filled with something dangerously close to fear, answered, "If we don't, we won't have an empire left." And so, for the first time, the Zalcor did what they had never done before. They ran. They abandoned Earth, their mighty warships limping away like wounded beasts, their once invincible army shattered by a species they had considered weak. Humanity watched them go, but they did not celebrate. Not yet. Because war was not just about survival. It was about making sure the enemy never came back, and humanity had just begun their hunt. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Zalcor retreat wasn't silent. It wasn't organized. It was a disaster. Their warships, once an unstoppable force in the galaxy, now moved like crippled animals, barely holding formation as they fled Earth's orbit. Some vessels burned as human-piloted fighters tore through them like wolves on wounded prey. Others were left behind, disabled, their crews slaughtered or taken prisoner. Humanity did not let them leave in peace. As the last of the invaders broke atmosphere and vanished into the void, the world stood in the eerie quiet of victory. Smoke still rose from the ruined cities. The echoes of battle still rang in the air, but for the first time since the war began, humanity could breathe. Yet there was no celebration. Because Earth had changed, the war had hardened people in ways no one could have foreseen. The nations of the world, once bitter rivals, had become something new, a unified force forged in fire and blood. And now, they were not just defenders. They were hunters. The Zalcor High Council received the reports with mounting horror. Their mighty fleets were in shambles, their forces were broken, their strategies useless against an enemy that refused to fight the way their past conquests had. The Supreme Warlord, a being known as Valir, slammed a clawed fist onto the polished obsidian table. "This is unacceptable. We are the Zalcor Dominion. We do not run from lesser creatures." The chamber remained silent. The other council members, a collection of warlords and strategists who had led the Dominion for centuries, sat motionless, their expressions unreadable. Valir turned to his second-in-command, a veteran general who had overseen dozens of planetary conquests. "You led the attack, Karok. Explain how a race of primitives destroyed an entire fleet." Karok's reptilian face twisted into something that looked dangerously close to shame. "They are not primitives," he said, his voice measured but heavy. "They are something else." Valir's eyes narrowed. They had no fleets, no planetary defenses. Their technology was barely past space travel. You were supposed to crush them. Karok exhaled slowly. They did not need fleets. They became the war itself. The silence stretched. And then a new sound broke through. A transmission. Intercepted. From the humans. The council turned as the holographic projection flickered to life. A human figure, clad in battle-worn armor, stood in the ruins of a devastated city. His face was bruised, blood dried on his cheek, but his eyes burned with something the Zalcor had never seen before. Rage. "You came to our world," the man said, his voice steady. "You slaughtered our people. You burned our homes." He stepped forward, closer to the recording device. "You thought we would beg, that we would kneel." His lips curled into something that almost resembled a smile, but it wasn't friendly. "You were wrong." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a growl. "We're coming for you." The transmission cut out. The High Council chamber was deathly silent. For the first time in its history, the Zalcor Dominion had an enemy it did not know how to fight. And it was terrified. Back on Earth, humanity wasted no time. Every downed Zalcor warship was stripped for parts, studied, rebuilt. Their weapons were repurposed, their technology hacked and modified. In mere weeks, human engineers had turned scavenged Dominion technology into something more powerful than its original design. And then, for the first time, humanity built its own fleet, not of bulky, outdated space shuttles or fragile exploratory vessels. These were warships, fast, lethal, built not for defense, but for conquest. A council of leaders from every surviving nation gathered in an underground bunker, one of the few places left untouched by the invasion. There, plans were laid out, objectives were decided, Earth had been attacked, and now Earth would strike back. The Zalcor Dominion believed itself untouchable. They believed no lesser species could stand against them. Humanity would teach them the cost of their arrogance. A single word was spoken in that darkened chamber, uttered by a man who had lost his family in the invasion. A man who had fought in the streets of his ruined city, watching his world burn. A word that would define the future of mankind. War. The first human warships left Earth's orbit a month later. A fleet, built from the wreckage of fallen invaders, piloted by men and women who had nothing left to lose. They did not wait for the Zalcor to return. They hunted them down. The Zalcor believed they had survived humanity's wrath. They were wrong. The war was not over. It was just beginning. The first human warships were nothing like the towering dreadnoughts of the Zalcor Dominion. They were smaller, built from salvaged alien technology and human ingenuity. Faster, more adaptable, and most importantly, unpredictable. The Zalcor fought like an empire, structured, methodical, confident in their superiority. Humans fought like survivors, ruthless, relentless, and utterly without fear. When the first fleet launched from Earth, it was not to explore, nor to negotiate. It was to hunt. In the vast emptiness of space, a lone Zalcor supply station orbited a desolate moon. It was a minor outpost, barely guarded, nothing more than a waypoint for Dominion warships returning from failed battles. Inside, the Zalcor officers stationed there had no idea they were being watched. The first sign of trouble came when their long-range scanners went dark. Then, the communications relays failed. By the time the alarms blared through the station's corridors, it was already too late. The human fleet had arrived. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand surrender. They struck like ghosts. Jet-black human warships, smaller than the Zalcors but faster and more maneuverable, descended on the outpost with terrifying precision. Modified Zalcor energy weapons lanced through the void, shredding the station's defenses before they could react. Before the Zalcor knew what was happening, human soldiers were inside, moving through the corridors like wraiths. They fought without hesitation, without mercy. The Zalcor, once the galaxy's most feared conquerors, found themselves trapped in their own fortress, hunted like animals in the dark. When the last Zalcor officer fell, clutching his bleeding chest, he managed to activate a distress signal, a single transmission sent out to any Dominion warships in range. "They are here," he gasped with his final breath. "The humans, they are here." The Zalcor High Council received the distress call within hours. They listened in silence. It was impossible. No species had ever dared attack Dominion space before. No species had ever survived long enough to try. But the humans had done more than survive. They were winning. The reports only grew worse. Supply lines disrupted, patrol fleets ambushed, strategic outposts going dark one by one, leaving only silence and wreckage behind. At first, the Dominion tried to fight back the way they always had, deploying larger fleets, mobilizing more troops. But no matter how many ships they sent, the humans were never where they expected. Humanity didn't fight the way other species did. They didn't march in formation, didn't follow predictable strategies. They struck from the shadows, disabled ships from within, sabotaged entire armadas before the battle even began. And worst of all, they learned. Every encounter, every skirmish, they adapted, turning the Zalkor's own strengths against them. For the first time, the High Council faced an enemy they could not outthink. For the first time, they were the ones being hunted. In the heart of Dominion space, the Supreme Warlord Valier sat in his war chamber, his claws digging into the armrest of his throne. The reports in front of him painted a picture he could barely comprehend. His generals stood before him, silent, waiting for his verdict. Finally, his voice broke the tense air. "What do they want?" he growled. "What are their demands?" No one spoke, because there had been no demands, no negotiations, no ultimatums, just destruction. The humans weren't looking for peace, they were looking for vengeance. Valier felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Back on Earth, the war had transformed humanity. They were no longer just a single species. They were something more, a force, a storm. United as one, they had become the very thing the Zalkor had feared. And they were not stopping. Not until the Dominion was nothing but ashes. Not until every last Zalkor had paid for what they had done. The hunters had become the hunted. And humanity would not rest until their enemies were wiped from the stars. The Zalkor Dominion was unraveling. What had once been an empire built on terror and conquest was now an empire running from terror. Their fleets no longer patrolled the stars with confidence. They hid. Their armies no longer invaded. They defended. And they were losing. Because humans did not fight like any enemy the Zalkor had ever known. They didn't stop. They didn't negotiate. They didn't give warnings. They just destroyed. The human war machine expanded faster than anyone could have imagined. Every Zalkor ship captured was repurposed. Every piece of alien technology was stripped, studied, improved. Factories on Earth, once built for industry, now churned out warships, weapons, and armor at a pace the Dominion couldn't match. For every human that fell, 10 more took their place, fueled by vengeance and rage. And for the first time, the Zalkor found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't just resist. They thrived in war. The first human invasion of a Zalkor world came faster than anyone had predicted. It wasn't one of the Dominion's core planets, but an outer colony, a massive industrial hub where Zalkor warships were constructed. They thought it was safe. They thought humanity wouldn't dare. They were wrong. The attack began in the dead of night. Orbital defenses that had stood for centuries were obliterated in minutes. Human drop pods rained from the sky, and before the Zalkor could even sound the alarm, their streets were flooded with human soldiers. The fighting was brutal. The Zalkor had spent millennia conquering planets, but they had never defended one before. They didn't know how. They weren't prepared for the way humans fought, not with honor, not with rules, but with the sole purpose of annihilation. Within 3 days, the colony fell. It wasn't just conquered, it was erased. Humanity left nothing standing. The war had started with Earth's cities burning. Now it was the Dominion's turn to burn. The news of the colony's fall reached the Zalkor High Council in mere hours. Panic spread like wildfire. Never, not once in their history, had an enemy taken one of their planets, and yet here they were, losing. The council chamber erupted into chaos, warlords shouting over one another, desperate for a strategy, any strategy, to stop the nightmare that was humanity. "They cannot be bargained with," one shouted. "They cannot be reasoned with," another hissed. "They are monsters." And then the Supreme Warlord Valier stood. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his gaze, only understanding. "We made a mistake," he said, his voice quiet but filled with finality. We did not conquer a species. We awakened a force we cannot contain." The chamber fell silent. Then, one of the younger council members, his voice trembling, spoke the words they had all feared. "What do we do?" Valir looked at the holographic map of the Dominion. One by one, human attacks were spreading, consuming the Empire like wildfire. There was only one choice left. "We run," Valir said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before they wipe us from existence." But humanity was not finished. They had taken their first world. Now they wanted more. They would have more. Because war was not just survival anymore. It was retribution. It was extermination. And humanity was just getting started. The Zalcor Dominion had ruled the stars for centuries, their empire stretching across countless systems, their power unquestioned. Until now. Until humanity. What had begun as a routine conquest, a species deemed unworthy of sovereignty, had turned into a war of survival. And the Zalcor were losing. The humans didn't fight like any species the Dominion had encountered before. They didn't just resist. They didn't just defend. They hunted. The fall of the first Zalcor colony sent shockwaves through the Dominion. In a matter of days, panic spread across the Empire. Civil unrest erupted in distant systems. Lesser warlords abandoned their posts, retreating to the far reaches of space. For the first time in recorded history, the Zalcor were afraid. For the first time, they were prey. Humanity wasted no time. Within weeks, the first conquered colony was transformed from a Zalcor stronghold into something new, a human war factory. What little Dominion technology remained was stripped down, studied, and reassembled into something far deadlier. Human engineers, once limited by Earth's slow progress, now worked with alien metals and energy weapons, fusing them into ships and weapons that the Zalcor had never seen before. With each passing day, humanity evolved, and the Dominion crumbled. On the Zalcor homeworld of Va'Run, the High Council had abandoned all pretense of control. Once proud warlords who had ruled the Empire without fear now cowered in their fortified chambers, their scales dull with stress, their voices filled with uncertainty. Reports flooded in like a never-ending nightmare. The humans weren't just attacking. They were dismantling the Dominion, one system at a time. Entire fleets were ambushed before they could regroup. Military bases that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble overnight. And the worst part? No one knew where humanity would strike next. They moved through space like wraiths, slipping past defenses, exploiting weaknesses the Zalcor had never considered. The Dominion's greatest strength, its size, had become its greatest weakness. And humanity was everywhere. The breaking point came when the Varial shipyard, the largest military production facility in the Empire, was wiped from existence. The Dominion had believed it untouchable. It was hidden deep within a nebula, surrounded by defensive stations, guarded by an armada of warships. It didn't matter. The humans found it, and they burned it. Every Zalcor warship under construction was torn apart before it could even launch. Every defensive platform was obliterated, and when the human fleet finally left, the once great shipyard was nothing more than drifting wreckage. It was not a battle. It was a massacre. And when the news reached the High Council, they finally understood the truth. Humanity did not just want to win. They wanted to erase the Dominion from existence. The Supreme Warlord Valir stood in silence as the reports played before him. He had ruled for decades. He had conquered hundreds of worlds. He had never known fear until now, because he knew what was coming next. He had seen what humanity was capable of, and he knew, without question, that they would not stop. Not until every last Zalcor was dead. Not until the Dominion was nothing but a memory. Not until the hunters had finished their hunt. Back on Earth, the final phase of the war was being prepared. Humanity had conquered its first alien world. Then another, and another. But it was not enough. Now they set their sights on Va'ruun, the heart of the Dominion, the place where it had all begun. The humans had waited long enough. It was time to end this war, not with surrender, not with peace, but with annihilation. The sky above Va'ruun, the Zalcor homeworld, darkened with the arrival of an enemy that should not have existed. Humanity had come. For the first time in their long history, the Zalcor saw an invasion fleet that did not belong to them. Massive human warships, once built from the wreckage of fallen Zalcor vessels, now moved in perfect formation, sleek and deadly. They bristled with energy weapons, modified, enhanced, and deadlier than they had ever been in Zalcor hands. From orbit, thousands of human drop pods rained down like falling stars, streaking through the atmosphere with terrifying precision. This was not a war. This was the execution of an empire. On the surface, Supreme Warlord Valir stood on the balcony of the Imperial Citadel, staring up at the sky as it burned. His homeworld, the heart of the Dominion, the birthplace of his people. And soon, it would be nothing but ash. He turned to his war council, what remained of them. Some had already fled. Others had taken their own lives rather than face what was coming. The rest stood frozen, their reptilian faces etched with something that should never have been possible. Terror. "We cannot surrender," one of them rasped, his claws digging into the metal table. "We must fight to the last breath." Valir said nothing, because he knew the truth. They had already lost. The humans were not here to accept surrender. They were here to finish what the Dominion had started. The first explosions ripped through the Zalcor capital minutes later. Human strike teams moved with terrifying efficiency, cutting through the streets, clearing every building, every bunker, every last pocket of resistance. They fought without hesitation, without remorse, without mercy. They had not forgotten what had happened to their home, and they had no intention of letting the Zalcor keep theirs. The Imperial Citadel was the last to fall. Valir stood in the throne room, his war armor gleaming under the dim red lights. He did not run. He did not beg. That was not the way of the Zalcor. But as the massive blast doors burst open, as human soldiers poured into the chamber, weapons raised, he understood the terrible, undeniable truth. His species had made a mistake that could never be undone, a mistake that had doomed them. The humans had been underestimated. They had been labeled as lesser, but they were not weak. They were monsters. And they had become the very thing the Zalcor had always feared. Hunters. Valir exhaled slowly, straightening his posture as the human commander stepped forward, his rifle trained on the warlord's chest. The man's face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with something ancient, something unrelenting. Vengeance. Valir bared his fangs. He would die like a warrior. But as the commander pulled the trigger, as the shot rang out and the Supreme Warlord's body hit the cold floor, Valir knew. This was not just his death. This was the death of his entire species. The war was over. Humanity had won. But victory was not enough. For months after the fall of Va'ruun, human warships scoured the galaxy, hunting down the remnants of the Zalcor. No survivors, no prisoners. The Dominion had shown no mercy. And now, neither did humanity. One by one, the last Zalcor colonies burned. One by one, their last warships vanished into the abyss, hunted to extinction. Until there was nothing left. Nothing but silence. Nothing but the memory of an empire that had once ruled the stars, and the species that had erased them. Earth had been avenged. The war was finished. But humanity was not the same. They had started as victims. Now they were something else entirely. Their fleet stretched across the stars, their weapons unmatched, their name whispered in fear, because the galaxy had learned a lesson that could never be forgotten. Never underestimate humanity. Never attack humanity. Never make humanity angry. Because when you do, you don't just lose, you cease to exist. The hunters had found their prey, and they had wiped it from the universe. The war was over. But humanity's reign had only just begun. The galaxy did not celebrate. There were no victory parades, no songs of triumph. There was only silence. The Zalcor Dominion, once the most feared empire in the known universe, had been reduced to nothing but scattered wreckage and dead worlds. Their homeworld was a graveyard. Their fleets were scrap. Their people were gone. Humanity had not just won. They had erased an empire from existence, and the galaxy had taken notice. With the Zalcor wiped from the stars, humanity stood at the edge of a terrifying realization. They had won, but at what cost? Earth still bore the scars of invasion. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of lives had been lost, and for every human who had fought in the war, something deeper had changed. They had become what they swore they never would be: conquerors. The first fleets returned home to celebrations, but the cheering did not last long. For every soldier who stepped off the transport ships, there was a hollow look in their eyes. They had not just fought for survival. They had hunted. They had exterminated. They had shown no mercy. And the worst part? They liked it. For the first time, humanity had tasted absolute power, and they knew the galaxy would never look at them the same way again. The rest of the galaxy had watched the war unfold with silent horror. Dozens of alien civilizations, some once fearful of the Zalcor, others neutral, had witnessed a species rise from the brink of destruction and become something far worse. A meeting was called. The Council of the Stars, a coalition of the most advanced species in the universe, gathered in a secret chamber deep within the neutral world of Juntar. They had seen empires rise and fall before. They had watched species come and go. But never had they seen a species like humanity. A race that could take their greatest weakness, being technologically behind, and turn it into their most lethal strength. A race that had adapted to war at an unnatural speed. A race that had wiped out the Zalcor so completely that not even their name would survive in the stars. And now, the Council had to make a decision. Would humanity be allowed to join them, or would they be declared too dangerous to exist? The debates lasted for days, but the conclusion was the same. They were afraid, not of what humanity had done, but of what humanity could do next. Back on Earth, the leaders of the newly united human government stood in the ruins of what was once the United Nations building. The war had changed everything. Humanity was no longer just a planet-bound species. They had fleets, weapons, and a reputation that stretched across the stars. The Zalcor had fallen, and now the entire galaxy was watching. Some whispered in fear, others whispered in opportunity, because for the first time, humanity was no longer just a species. They were a power, and the galaxy had two choices: to accept them or to fear them. And if history had taught the universe anything, it was that fearing humanity was a very, very dangerous thing to do. The war was over, but humanity's story had only just begun. The sky above Earth had turned into a battlefield. Alien warships, massive and menacing, blotted out the sun as they descended from orbit. The Zeleri had come, not to negotiate, not to warn, but to conquer. Their plasma cannons rained fire upon cities, leveling buildings, turning streets into molten craters, and reducing humanity's monuments to dust. Across the world, governments fell into chaos, scrambling to mount a defense against the overwhelming force. The Zalari had expected submission. They had conquered 100 worlds before, each one folding under their technological superiority. They assumed Earth would be no different. They were wrong. Amidst the rubble of New York, a lone soldier stood. His face was smeared with dirt and blood, his combat armor scorched from the fires of battle. His rifle, though battered, was still gripped tightly in his hands. The last remnants of his unit lay broken around him, their bodies strewn across the shattered concrete. He was alone, outnumbered, and surrounded by towering alien warriors. A Zalari commander, standing nearly 9 feet tall, stepped forward. Its chitinous exoskeleton glistened under the flickering lights of burning skyscrapers. It sneered in its guttural language, believing the human was too weak to fight back. But the soldier wasn't afraid. He spat blood onto the ground and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Then, through gritted teeth, he spoke words that would echo in history. "You dared attack Earth, now you'll pay." His words weren't just a threat, they were a promise, and the Zalari would soon learn the terrifying truth about humanity. The resistance had begun. The first days of the invasion were a massacre, but humans didn't crumble. They adapted. The remaining armies across the world, once divided by borders and politics, now fought as one. Civilians became soldiers. Scientists turned their minds toward war. Factories that once made cars and computers now churned out weapons designed to exploit every weakness the aliens had. And their greatest weapon? Rage. The Zalari had never encountered anything like it. Most species they had conquered begged for mercy. They surrendered at the first sign of defeat. But humans fought even when they had nothing left. They didn't just defend. They hunted. In the ruins of Tokyo, a group of engineers hacked into the Zalari's own systems, turning their war machines against them. In the forests of Brazil, guerrilla fighters used their intimate knowledge of the land to ambush the invaders, striking from the shadows like ghosts. In the icy wastelands of Siberia, human snipers picked off commanders from miles away, their shots precise and merciless. And in the skies above, Earth's surviving pilots waged a desperate aerial war, dodging alien lasers and missiles, pushing their outdated but resilient jets beyond their limits. The Zalari may have had superior technology, but humans had something even more powerful: determination. The lone soldier who had stood against the commander in New York wasn't forgotten. His defiance spread like wildfire. Videos of his last stand, of his words, "You dared attack Earth, now you'll pay," were broadcast across every remaining human stronghold. He became a symbol, and soon Earth wasn't just fighting for survival. It was fighting for revenge. The tide of war was beginning to shift. The Zalari had expected a swift conquest. What they got was a war they weren't prepared to fight. For the first time in their history, they were afraid. The Zalari fleet, once an unstoppable force of conquest, found itself caught in a nightmare it couldn't understand. The humans refused to surrender. Every inch of Earth's soil was a battleground, every city a fortress, every ruined street a death trap. The Zalari had the numbers, the firepower, and the technology, but none of it seemed to matter. At first, they dismissed humanity's defiance as foolishness. They believed that crushing resistance was only a matter of time. But as days turned to weeks, that belief wavered. Then came the first true blow to their invasion. In the war-torn ruins of London, a squad of human engineers accomplished what no alien species had before. They captured a Zalari command ship. It wasn't just an act of rebellion. It was an act of war on a scale the Zalari had never encountered. Using reverse-engineered technology, human scientists worked around the clock to crack into the ship's systems. They learned the weaknesses of the Zalari fleet, dissecting their strategies, finding vulnerabilities no species had ever exploited before. And with that knowledge, the humans struck back harder than ever. Zalari battleships, once thought invincible, were suddenly falling from the sky. Their shields, once impenetrable, flickered and failed under precise human strikes. The same weapons they had used to rain destruction upon Earth were now being turned against them. For the first time, the Zalari were not the hunters. They were the hunted. The turning point came when Earth's resistance, now organized into a single global force, launched a counteroffensive in the United States. The Zalari had set up their primary war command center in Washington, D.C., believing that human leadership had been shattered. What they hadn't counted on was the sheer unpredictability of human ingenuity. The plan was brutal, desperate, and utterly brilliant. A coalition of former special forces, cyber warfare experts, and volunteer fighters infiltrated the heart of the Zalari's stronghold. Using stolen alien weapons, they moved like shadows through the night, cutting down patrols, sabotaging supply lines, and hacking into their systems. Then, when the moment was right, they sent a single message, broadcasted across every communication network the Zalari used. It was a face the invaders recognized. The same soldier who had stood alone in New York, the one who had spoken the words that had become Earth's battle cry. His face was battered, his eyes burned with fury, and his voice was cold as steel. "We gave you a chance to leave. You didn't listen. Now it's our turn." And with that, the humans unleashed hell. Explosions erupted across Washington, D.C. in a synchronized assault. Resistance fighters emerged from the shadows, wielding both human and alien weapons, tearing through Zalari ranks with terrifying efficiency. Makeshift tanks, built from scavenged parts and repurposed enemy tech, rolled through the streets, crushing anything in their path. From the air, hacked Zalari dropships, piloted by human defectors, rained fire down upon the enemy. The Zalari, who had once believed Earth would fall within days, now found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and outmatched. But the true devastation came when the human hackers, embedded deep in the Zalari command center, finally executed their final move. They had cracked into the Zalari fleet's command network, and with one simple command, they shut it down. Across Earth's skies, alien ships powered down mid-flight. Their shields flickered and died. Their weapons ceased firing. A fleet that had once dominated the galaxy now hung helplessly in orbit, like prey awaiting the final blow, and the humans delivered it without hesitation. In a coordinated global strike, every remaining Earth defense force, every scavenged Zalari weapon, every fighter still able to stand turned their firepower upward. Missiles, railguns, plasma cannons, everything was unleashed in a final act of vengeance. The Zalari fleet, once proud and mighty, burned. And for the first time in history, the Zalari fled. But Earth wasn't finished. The war had begun with an invasion. Now it was time for retaliation. The Zalari retreat was a sight never before witnessed in galactic history. Their empire had conquered 100 worlds, reduced civilizations to dust, and ruled with an iron grip for centuries. They had never lost a war. They had never fled from battle. Until now. The remnants of their once mighty fleet limped into deep space, their warships battered, their command structure shattered. Earth's skies, once darkened by the looming presence of alien dreadnoughts, were now filled with the smoking remains of their wreckage. But humanity wasn't celebrating. Not yet. The Zalari had come to wipe Earth from existence. They had slaughtered millions, turned cities into graveyards, and forced an entire planet to the brink of extinction. And now that they were running, humanity had only one thing on its mind: Revenge. As the last Zalari ships fled Earth's orbit, the new Human War Council gathered in what remained of Geneva. Once a place of peace and diplomacy, it now served as the nerve center for Earth's counterattack. Military leaders, scientists, and resistance fighters, those who had survived the invasion, stood around a holographic map of the galaxy. For the first time in history, humanity was united under one banner, and their first mission was clear. "Track their retreat," said General Vasquez, the hardened leader of Earth's surviving military forces. "I want to know exactly where they're running." A team of cyber warfare specialists using stolen Zalari data worked through the night. By morning, they had their answer. The Zalari were retreating to a fortified outpost in a nearby star system, a planet called Vorlax 7. It was a military stronghold, heavily defended, and home to tens of thousands of Zalari troops. Perfect. "We take the fight to them," said the soldier whose defiance had sparked the resistance. His name was Captain Eric Cole, and his face had become the symbol of Earth's rage. He pointed at the holographic display, eyes burning with fury. "They came here expecting an easy victory," he said. "Now we show them what it means to be hunted." Earth's forces had no grand fleet, no mighty warships, but they had something far deadlier: human ingenuity. They scavenged Zalari technology, reverse engineering it faster than anyone had thought possible. Within weeks, they had assembled a fleet of stolen alien ships, outfitted with human modifications, more aggressive targeting systems, enhanced maneuverability, and weapons fine-tuned for destruction. The Zalari had underestimated humans once. They wouldn't live long enough to make that mistake again. The invasion fleet, made up of Earth's best pilots, soldiers, and cyber warfare units, launched from hidden bases across the world. Their mission wasn't just to strike back, it was to send a message. And that message was simple: you dared attack Earth, now we're coming for you. Vorlax 7 never saw them coming. The Zalari, still reeling from their disastrous defeat, believed Earth was too weak to retaliate. Their defenses were lax, their forces unprepared. They had no idea that death was already falling from the sky. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace like a storm. They moved fast, hitting key targets before the Zalari could react. Military installations exploded in massive fireballs. Defensive turrets were hacked and turned against their own soldiers. Then came the ground assault. Eric Cole and his team dropped onto the surface in stolen Zalari dropships, cutting through enemy lines like a blade through flesh. They fought with brutal efficiency, not as conquerors, but as executioners. For every human city that had burned, they burned 10 Zalari outposts. For every human life lost, they took 100 in return. The Zalari begged for surrender. Some tried to flee. Others threw down their weapons, hoping for mercy. Humanity had none to give. Vorlax 7 was turned into a graveyard. And it was only the beginning. Back on Earth, the news of the counterattack spread like wildfire. The people, once victims of an alien onslaught, now stood victorious. But they weren't content with just one battle. The war for vengeance had begun. No longer was humanity a species waiting for destruction. Now, they were the ones who would burn the galaxy down. The fall of Vorlax 7 sent shockwaves across the Zalari Empire. They had expected humanity to be another forgotten casualty in their long history of conquest. Instead, they had created a nightmare, a species that refused to die, that adapted faster than anything they had ever faced, and that was now fueled by nothing but vengeance. Across the galaxy, Zalari governors and military officials scrambled to prepare defenses. Fleets were repositioned, fortress worlds were reinforced, entire sectors were locked down under martial law. None of it would be enough, because humanity had declared war, and war was all they knew now. On Earth, the captured Zalari technology was being pushed to its absolute limits. Human engineers, fueled by rage and desperation, worked day and night to unlock the secrets of their enemies' machines. And in doing so, they created something terrifying. Within months, Earth's industrial centers, rebuilt from the ashes of invasion, began churning out warships at an unprecedented rate. But these weren't just stolen Zalari designs. These were human warships, crafted with the sole purpose of annihilation. Faster, deadlier, more brutal than anything the galaxy had ever seen. Their names were a warning, retribution, wrath, vengeance, hellfire, each one a promise that the Zalari's sins would be paid for in blood. And at the heart of this new fleet was a single ship, the largest, most fearsome warship humanity had ever built. Its hull was reinforced with scavenged Zalari plating. Its weapons were a mix of alien and human firepower, and its name was whispered like a prayer among Earth's soldiers. Judgment Day. Eric Cole stood on its bridge, staring out into the endless void of space. The war was far from over. The Zalari still held dozens of worlds under their rule, each one a reminder of the atrocities they had committed. "We take back what they stole," Cole said, his voice cold, his eyes burning. "We burn their empire to the ground." The officers around him nodded. There was no hesitation, no fear, because Earth had already suffered the worst the galaxy could throw at them. And now it was their turn to strike. The first target was Draelus Prime, a key Zalari supply world deep within their empire. It was heavily fortified, with orbital defenses and planetary shields that had stood untouched for centuries. The Zalari believed it to be impenetrable. They were wrong. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace like a hurricane. Unlike the Zalari, who fought with precision and calculated strategy, humanity fought with rage. They didn't just disable enemy ships, they tore them apart. They didn't just invade the planet, they razed it. Zalari forces tried to hold the line. They failed. For every human that fell, 100 Zalari died screaming. The battle lasted less than a day. By the time the sun set on Draelus Prime, the Zalari flag had been torn down, and in its place stood something new. The symbol of Earth, the first conquered world of the human empire. Across the galaxy, word of humanity's retaliation spread like wildfire. Other species, once too afraid to resist the Zalari, began to rise up. Rebel factions launched uprisings on occupied worlds. Entire colonies declared independence, and at the heart of it all was Earth. The Zalari had started this war. Now humanity would finish it. The fall of Draelus Prime was only the beginning. Humanity had tasted vengeance, and they would not stop until the Zalari Empire was nothing more than dust. Across the stars, human warships spread like wildfire. They struck with terrifying precision, appearing out of nowhere, dismantling Zalari defenses, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. The Zalari, once the undisputed rulers of the galaxy, were being hunted. Their strongholds burned, their fleets shattered. Their leaders, once arrogant and untouchable, were now fleeing like rats, desperately searching for a place to hide. But there was nowhere left to run, because humanity was coming. On the bridge of Judgment Day, Captain Eric Cole stood with his arms crossed, staring at the holographic map of the Zalari Empire. It was vast, stretching across hundreds of systems, but it was bleeding, and humans were the ones holding the knife. "What's the next target?" he asked, his voice cold, his fury controlled but ever burning. A young strategist pointed to a planet deep in Zalari-controlled space. "Vorshak, a major shipyard. If we take it, they won't be able to replace their losses." Cole nodded. "Then we take it." And just like that, humanity's next assault began. Vorshak was the lifeline of the Zalari military. It produced thousands of warships every year, each one meant to keep their empire in power. If it fell, the Zalari wouldn't just be weakened, they'd be crippled. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, every warship primed for destruction. Unlike before, they didn't waste time. There were no warnings, no negotiations. This wasn't war anymore. It was extermination. The first wave of human warships obliterated the orbital defenses in minutes. Precision strikes disabled the shipyard's automated defenses. Zalari fleets scrambled to counterattack, but they were too slow, too predictable. Humanity had learned from their enemy, and now they were better. The ground assault was just as brutal. Elite human soldiers, enhanced by stolen Zalari combat technology, dropped onto the planet's surface like avenging angels. They did not take prisoners. The Zalari, who had once enslaved and slaughtered weaker species without mercy, now found themselves on the receiving end of human wrath. Factories burned, shipyards crumbled, entire Zalari battalions were wiped out before they could even form a defense. By the time the battle was over, Vorshak was nothing more than a wasteland of twisted metal and shattered bodies. And humanity had won. Again. The Zalari Senate, once a council of rulers who controlled the galaxy without fear, was now in a state of panic. Every time they regrouped, humans struck. Every time they prepared for a counterattack, humans outmaneuvered them. And worst of all, every time they begged for peace, humanity ignored them, because Earth had not forgotten. They remembered the cities that burned, the millions who died, the families that had been wiped from existence, and they had sworn one thing. The Zalari would never get the chance to do it again. The war was reaching its final phase. There was only one place left to strike: the Zalari homeworld. It was time to end them. The Zalari homeworld, Zelvas, had stood for millennia as the unchallenged heart of their empire. A planet of towering obsidian spires, endless military complexes, and palatial seats of power where the Senate had ruled the galaxy with an iron fist. It had never known war. Until now. Because Earth had come for vengeance. The human fleet arrived in Zelvas space like the wrath of a vengeful god. What was once a thriving system, filled with Zalari warships and bustling trade routes, was now a graveyard. Dozens of Zalari fleets, once meant to defend the Empire, had been annihilated in previous battles. Those that remained were a pale shadow of their former power, outnumbered, outgunned, and worst of all, afraid. And they had every reason to be. Because the humans didn't come to conquer. They came to destroy. On the bridge of Judgment Day, Captain Eric Cole watched as his fleet moved into formation. Hundreds of human warships, some stolen from the Zalari and others built from the ruins of Earth's invasion, surrounded the planet like a noose tightening around its prey. The Zalari sent a desperate transmission. A plea for mercy. The Zalari never begged. And yet, here they were. Cole stared at the incoming message, his jaw tightening. He could still remember the screams of New York, the bodies burned to ash in Tokyo. The Zalari hadn't asked for mercy when they came for Earth, so why should humanity give them any? He shut the transmission off. "Commence orbital bombardment," he ordered, and the sky turned to fire. The Zalari homeworld had the strongest planetary shields in the galaxy. They lasted 4 hours before they collapsed. The first wave of human missiles turned their mighty spires into rubble. Plasma strikes shattered their golden palaces. Explosions tore through the streets where Zalari senators had once walked, believing they were untouchable. And then came the ground assault. Elite human soldiers, wearing armor crafted from scavenged alien tech, dropped into the cityscapes like harbingers of death. They moved like ghosts, their tactics precise, their weapons relentless. The Zalari military, once the terror of the galaxy, fought back with everything they had. It wasn't enough. For every human that fell, 100 Zalari died screaming. For every street they tried to defend, humans burned 10 of theirs in retaliation. This wasn't a battle. It was judgment. The Zalari Senate, the rulers of the Empire, made their final stand in the Grand Palace, the very heart of their dominion. They barricaded themselves behind walls of steel, surrounded by their finest warriors. They thought they could negotiate, that if they surrendered they could save themselves. They still didn't understand. Humanity wasn't interested in peace. Cole led the final assault himself. His team breached the palace doors, cutting through Zalari guards like they were nothing. The senators, trembling, pleaded for their lives. They offered power. They offered wealth. Cole raised his rifle. "You dared attack Earth," he said coldly. Then he pulled the trigger, and the Zalari Empire died. The war was over. Zelvus burned. The last of the Zalari fleets were destroyed. Their species, once the rulers of the galaxy, were now nothing more than scattered survivors, running from the ghosts of the billions they had slaughtered. And humanity? Humanity had won. But they had become something else in the process. They were no longer just survivors. They were now the new rulers of the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The age of Earth had begun. The fires of Zelvus burned for weeks. The once glorious capital of the Zalari Empire had been reduced to ash and ruin. Its towering spires, once symbols of power, were now nothing but crumbling skeletons under a sky choked with smoke. The last remnants of the Zalari people, those who had managed to survive, wandered through the ruins like ghosts. They had once ruled the stars. Now they were a broken, dying species, and Earth had made sure of it. On board Judgment Day, Eric Cole stood on the bridge, watching as the fires of the Zalari homeworld flickered below. His face, once filled with rage, was now stone cold. Victory should have felt like justice. Instead, it felt empty. "We did it," one of his officers said beside him. "We won." Cole exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening into fists. Had they really won? They had avenged Earth, yes. But in doing so, they had become something else entirely. Humanity was no longer the underdog fighting for survival. Now, they were the new conquerors, and the galaxy would never forget it. The destruction of the Zalari Empire sent shockwaves across the galaxy. Species that had once suffered under the Zalari's rule celebrated their downfall. On distant planets, the enslaved were now free, their chains broken by Earth's wrath. But not everyone saw humanity as saviors. To some, they were worse than the Zalari. The speed at which humans had adapted to war terrified the rest of the galaxy. No species had ever fought back like Earth. No civilization had ever turned their suffering into pure, unrelenting vengeance. Now, whispers spread through the void. The galaxy had traded one master for another, and Earth was far more dangerous. Across the ruins of their once great empire, the last surviving Zalari begged for mercy. Some tried to flee into the shadows of the galaxy, hoping to hide on uncharted worlds. Others surrendered, pleading for their lives. But Earth was divided. Many humans demanded total extermination. They wanted the Zalari wiped from existence, just as they had tried to do to Earth. Others, however, argued for mercy. A small faction believed that if humanity destroyed an entire species, they would be no better than the monsters they had fought against. A vote was held among Earth's new leaders. The decision? The Zalari would be exiled. The surviving remnants of their species were loaded onto ships and sent into the deep void, banished from the known galaxy. They would wander the stars forever, their once mighty empire nothing more than a ghost story. But some whispered that the Zalari would never forget. And one day, they might return. With the Zalari destroyed, Earth stood alone as the most powerful force in the galaxy, and power demanded order. The leaders of the resistance, once ordinary soldiers and freedom fighters, now became rulers. A new government was formed, not a democracy, but a militarized empire, forged in the fires of war. Earth no longer fought for survival. Now they ruled the stars. Human fleets patrolled former Zalari space, enforcing their own laws. Entire planets swore loyalty to the human empire. Some did so willingly. Others? They didn't have a choice. The other alien species, once oppressed by the Zalari, were now terrified of humanity. They had cheered when Earth destroyed their former masters. But as the smoke cleared, they began to wonder if they had simply traded one tyrant for another. Some of them tried to resist Earth's rule. They were crushed. The message was clear: submit or suffer the fate of the Zalari. Some species bowed immediately, swearing allegiance to the new human empire. Others vanished into deep space, hoping to avoid Earth's wrath. But a few whispered of rebellion, because in every empire there are always those who refuse to kneel. Not all humans were proud of what Earth had become. Some remembered when humanity had fought for freedom, not conquest, when they had been defenders, not rulers. Now, they were becoming the very thing they had once hated. A secret resistance began to grow within Earth's own ranks. Soldiers who once fought for vengeance now fought for redemption. They called themselves the Last Light. Their goal? To stop the human empire before it became a new age of terror. And if that meant fighting their own people, so be it. As Earth spread its dominion across the stars, something stirred in the darkness. Something ancient, something far worse than the Zalari. A deep space probe, launched from Earth's capital, disappeared near the dead systems, a region of space so feared that even the Zalari had never dared explore it. Before the signal was lost, it sent back one final transmission, a single image, a fleet, not Zalari, not human, something else, and then a voice, a deep, unfathomable voice that sent chills through every scientist who heard it. We see you, Earth. We watched you destroy the Zalari. Now, we are coming. Humanity had fought to survive. They had conquered to avenge. But now they would face something beyond war, because the true test of Earth's might was only just beginning. The message from the dead systems sent a ripple of fear through Earth's leadership. For years, humanity had been the unstoppable force, the hunters, the conquerors, the rulers. They had burned the Zalari Empire to the ground, reduced their enemies to ash, and established themselves as the dominant power in the galaxy. But now, something else was watching them. Something older than the Zalari, something that had never feared them. And worst of all, it was coming. Earth's War Council, once a symbol of human unity, was split. Some wanted to prepare for war, to strike first before this unknown threat could act. Others argued that Earth had already lost too much, that they couldn't afford another war so soon. But Eric Cole? He had seen too much death. He had fought too long, and in his gut, he knew one thing. We have to be ready. So in secret, Earth's top scientists, engineers, and strategists began preparing for the worst. They built weapons unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They trained soldiers for a war against the unknown. They sent scouts into the dead systems, searching for answers, but none of them returned. The first true encounter happened 6 months later. A deep space human fleet, patrolling the edge of known space, vanished without a trace. At first, Earth thought it was an accident, a malfunction, a jump drive failure. Then, a single escape pod drifted back into human space. Inside, a lone survivor, a man who had been driven mad. His eyes were hollow, his body covered in scars that weren't made by any known weapon. He screamed when they tried to question him. He clawed at his own face, repeating the same phrase over and over again. They aren't like the Zeleri. They don't conquer. They consume. Then, before anyone could stop him, he took his own life. Humanity had believed they were the most dangerous force in the galaxy. They were wrong, because something far worse had arrived. They were called the Nightfall, a species that didn't conquer, didn't enslave, didn't negotiate. They erased. Their ships were monstrous, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Black, jagged, pulsating with energy that didn't register on human scanners. Their weapons didn't fire beams or projectiles. They ripped reality apart, turning entire warships into dust in seconds. And their soldiers? They weren't alive. They were shadows, figures wrapped in obsidian armor that moved faster than human eyes could follow. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They devoured everything in their path. And now they had set their sights on Earth. The war against the Nightfall wasn't a war. It was a slaughter. Human fleets, once unstoppable, were ripped apart like paper. Planets fell in days, their populations erased without a trace. Weapons that had crushed the Zeleri did nothing against this new enemy. For the first time since Earth's rise to power, humanity was outmatched. And for the first time, Eric Cole felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. But humanity had not fought this long just to die. They had one last chance, a desperate, reckless plan that could either save them or end them forever. The scientists of Earth discovered something: a weakness. The Nightfall weren't invincible. Their ships, their soldiers, they weren't from this universe. They were intruders, existing in a half-reality, slipping in and out of space like ghosts. That's why conventional weapons did nothing. That's why no one could stop them. But if Earth could rip open the veil between realities, if they could expose the Nightfall fully, they could kill them. It was a gamble, a final stand. And if it failed, there would be nothing left of Earth. No history, no memory, nothing. The last of Earth's fleets gathered above the burning remains of Mars. It was here that humanity would make its last stand. The Nightfall came in the millions. Their black, jagged warships filled the sky, darkening the stars. And then Eric Cole gave the order. Activate the Rift Bomb. A device built with every last ounce of Earth's technology tore a hole through reality itself. And suddenly, the Nightfall weren't untouchable anymore. Human weapons, for the first time, hit their mark. The impossible, invincible enemy bled, and humanity unleashed hell. The battle lasted 3 days. Earth's fleet was all but destroyed. Millions of humans died. Entire planets were lost forever. But the Nightfall? They were eradicated. The Rift Bomb had done what no species had ever dared. It had closed the gateway between dimensions, trapping the Nightfall in their own world forever. Humanity had won, but at a cost no one could comprehend. Earth was no longer just a survivor, no longer just an empire. They had become something else entirely. They had killed gods, and the galaxy would never recover. The war had ended. But as Eric Cole stood on the ruins of Mars, staring at the sky, he knew the truth. Something else was out there, something watching, something waiting. And one day, it would come for them. But when that day arrived, humanity wouldn't run. They wouldn't beg. They would do what they had always done. They would fight. And this time, they would win. Because Earth never forgets, and Earth never forgives. The age of humanity had only just begun.